Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Gripe. This is a special episode of Gripe, although, let's be realistic here, all of them are special episodes. Aww. But today's episode is actually kind of different, one of my just random episodes, something I'm trying to think about. And today I'm going to answer the big question that has been on everybody's mind since the beginning of science fiction television and movies. Which one is better, Star Wars or Star Trek? Now that's a lie, because actually I'm not going to answer that. But I am going to look at Star Trek and Star Wars, because there's a question that's been plaguing my mind, especially with the release of Star Trek Beyond this past weekend. And it helps to compare the two, since there is obviously some very close similarities between them. So, obviously the question comes up pretty often, which one is better, Star Trek or Star Wars? Many of us are fans of both. I'm probably more of a Star Wars fan than a Star Trek fan, but I enjoy Star Trek for what it is as a science fiction show. Some people are a little bit more discerning. They will choose one over the other for various reasons, for good reasons, but ultimately it's kind of a matter of opinion. But it's a reasonable comparison between the two, since the history of the two franchises is so deep. Basically, the first Star Trek series started in 1966, and then 11 years later, after the series was over, and they actually had an animated series briefly in there as well, Star Wars came out in 1977, and from there it basically became this, Star Trek and Star Wars both existing at the same time. And both of them have had a significant impact on pop culture. I mean, just like the amount of, Star Wars and Star Trek memorabilia and all that stuff you can get out there is incredible. There's a ton of it, because obviously both franchises there's a lot of love for both franchises. And I'm not going to like I said, I'm not going to settle which one is better, because it's entirely a matter of opinion. But there is one particular aspect I do want to address. And that aspect is the box office. So, this past weekend, Star Trek Beyond opened to just under $60 million here in the United States. And that is obviously not what they were hoping for, but given what they had seen from the previous two Star Trek movies in this rebooted franchise, it was still considered a moderate success. I mean, $60 million for a $185 million budget, not counting marketing and all that stuff. $60 million, obviously not the best that they could get, but certainly a success, and by far the number one movie for the weekend. So it's still considered a moderate success, but it's down from what we saw with the last sequel, which was Star Trek Into Darkness, and even more from 2009's rebooted Star Trek franchise. Episode 7, Star Wars The Force Awakens, which opened last December, opened its first weekend with $248 million, basically. Which, obviously, if you do the math on that, and I'm not very good at math, but in this case, if you did the math, you'd pretty much see that that's about 4 times what Star Trek made. In one weekend, Star Wars made 4 times what Star Trek made in one weekend. So, that's big, especially given the fact that Star Wars came out in December, which is not known for huge blockbuster success, whereas in the summer, everybody can go to the movies because nobody's working, except me. But both franchises overall have been highly successful at the box office. The entire Star Trek film series has made around $2 billion worldwide, with only one real flop, and that would be Star Trek Nemesis, which came out in 2002. When I say flop, I just mean financially. That's the only one that really was not successful, as opposed to the rest of the other 11 Star Trek movies, not counting Beyond. All of them were financially successful. Star Wars Episode 7 alone made over $2 billion. Now that's obviously in 2015, 2016 dollars, but still, I mean, $2 billion, that's a significant amount of change for one movie when compared against the $2 billion for Star Trek, which has had, Star Trek Beyond is the 13th Star Trek movie. Now, when adjusted for inflation, all 7 live-action Star Wars movies made over $700 million. So if you put them all into perspective, every single one of them, when you take their worldwide gross, made over $700 million. Whereas with the Star Trek series, there have only been a handful of them that have actually come close to that number. And that begs the question, why is one of these long-running franchises more successful than the other? And not just more successful, but far more successful, financially speaking. So I'm not going to answer the pop culture side because, again, that's a matter of opinion. But financially speaking, Star Wars has proven to be far more successful than Star Trek. So I'm going to throw some theories at you. Theory number one is the fundamental differences between the two series. Star Trek is a science fiction-based show and movie series. The show is concept-driven. It takes real concepts, events. It's the exploration into the unknown and questioning human morality in outer space. Obviously, some important questions that they're going to be asking. Star Wars, on the other hand, is, even though people say it's sci-fi because it's set in space, Star Wars is much more a fantasy that just happens to be set in space. The story is a soap opera. It's built around mythology and belief and all these other, kind of intangible structures. And at the core of the story is conflict. I mean, hell, it's in the name, for crying out loud. Star Wars. Conflict is central to the entire story. And the big difference here is obviously when you're dealing with science fiction, you're dealing with real life concepts of like saying, okay, this is what we know in our real world. How can we imagine the future where something like this is possible, or where we can take grounded science and explode it into the possibilities that there are, as opposed to Star Wars, which is far more about, things that are like the Force. And when they try to explain it with scientific reasoning, it sounds ridiculous. I don't need to even mention the word midichlorians without people just cringing, because Star Wars is not science fiction. It is fantasy. But one of the things about that is that it's easier for the majority of people to digest melodrama than it is to digest sci-fi concepts. It's easier to take in fantasy than science fiction, which is actually challenging people. Not everyone's interested in those challenging ideas or the science, the propositions of what science can be. It's why a show like Fringe was popular in a small group, but not as widely popular as something, as it could have been, which it probably should have been. When you're actually dealing with scientific concepts and human morality, things like that, not everybody is interested in that. It's so much easier to just get enveloped in melodrama and the soap opera type of story. In fact, some of the biggest criticisms that people have of the Star Wars prequels is that there was a heavy focus on politics and economics. And that's stuff that Star Trek talks about all the time. There's always this talk about diplomacy and politics and peace and all this stuff. And even though the reboots, the J.J. Abrams reboots have kind of shifted that focus, it's still at the core of what Star Trek is. I mean, the whole point of the Federation is this exploration into the unknown to, find new worlds, encounter new races, and basically create a giant unity. Whereas with Star Wars, the story is focused on the Skywalker family and their serious drama. But fantasy rouses the imagination too. And it's a lot easier to sell fantasy to a wider audience, particularly because it's easier to sell to kids. I mean, obviously kids, you want them to know science, you want them to get interested in these real-world grounded concepts, but it's a lot easier to sell fantasy to a child than it is to sell hard science or theory. It's also an easier way to merchandise when you can sell it to the masses so much easier. That's not to say Star Trek doesn't have great merchandise, but when you have, adorable little Ewok characters that, kids can, play with, and Yodas and all this other stuff, of course, the kids are going to go for that, and the families are going to, bring their children to that. So there's definitely this fundamental difference between science fiction and the fantasy between these two series. So that's one of my theories as to why Star Wars is more financially successful, is that fundamental difference. Now, theory number 2 is saturation. There have been 13 movies and 5 live-action series since 1966 for Star Trek. There's also a new live-action series coming in 2017, and there was, as I said, a short-lived animated series in the 70s. For Star Wars, there have only been 8 movies, 8 theatrical release movies, and that includes the animated Clone Wars movie, which came out after the release of the prequels. There's also some other things that exist in the Star Wars universe, some television shows like Clone Wars and Rebels, as well as a few TV movies that came out in the 80s, the Ewok Adventures, and the much maligned Christmas special. But I mean, realistically speaking, Star Trek has a much broader wealth of content than Star Wars has had since 1977. So And outside of the films and television, both of them have extensive media, which includes books, fan fiction, comic books, toys, video games, etc. There's so much out there that both of these franchises have given to pop culture. But when it comes to movies, Star Wars has been more lucrative financially, as well as just marketing-wise. Star Wars has been more lucrative. What's interesting is that the Star Trek film franchise was basically a response to the success of Star Wars. Now, it didn't necessarily was like, oh, Star Wars did it, so now we can do it too. They were actually wanting to do a Star Trek movie for quite a long time after the original series ended in 1969. They wanted to, bring the crew back and, have their adventures go into, another, a whole new show. In fact, there was a show that they were working on prior to the Star Trek the Motion Picture coming out, which is called Star Trek Phase 2. And when Star Trek Phase 2 kind of fizzled out was when Star Wars came out and Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out in 1978. And they saw, okay, with these two movies, people are going to be really interested in digesting like science fiction again. So even though Star Wars was considered fantasy, it showed the willingness of people to go to a movie like that. Not to mention with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was much more science fiction based, they said, okay, let's actually do this as a movie. And in 1979, we got Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now, notably, this movie is considered mediocre. It has a pretty low Metacritic score from the critics who actually looked at it back in the 80s. Or 79. When the movie originally came out, they basically said, okay, this movie is somewhat dull. Now, granted, their goal was not to make an exciting movie like Star Wars. They wanted to make something more grounded in science. The result, probably not the best. I think they could have done a little bit better. But it still was, it basically launched in response to what the success that Star Wars brought about. And from then, basically, Star Trek movies were coming out much more frequently. Star Trek, the motion picture, came out in 79, followed by Wrath of Khan, and so on and so forth. There were basically, of the 13 movies, the longest gap between those movies was 7 years between Nemesis and the Star Trek reboot in 2009. That's the longest gap between movies. And the movies themselves are much more episodic in those individual installments. Even though there are connections to the different movies, they're still episodic. You have the motion picture, you have Wrath of Khan, which the two don't really connect to each other. It's kind of, this is another adventure. Even though Search for Spock does kind of pull from what happens in Wrath of Khan, for the most part, the stories do tell a contained story, and it's just a continuation of these adventures. Star Wars had a 16-year gap between episodes 6 and episodes 1, which basically the Return of the Jedi and the Phantom Menace, there was a 16-year gap between those. And when episode 3 came out, there was a 10-year gap between that and episode 7. So obviously there's a much bigger gap in between those movies that makes it a little bit more interesting, more intriguing for people to be like, oh, let's see what they're doing with it now, as opposed to every couple of years getting a new installment. Not to mention the fact that Star Wars episodes 1 through 7 are all part of one story. There's not a episode, even though they're episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's not episodic in the sense of like the stories aren't connected to one another. The whole episodes 1 through 7 is connected. And that sparsity actually helps with marketing, because all you have to do is basically say Star Wars, and that might be enough to sell a property. Rogue One is a good example of this, since the trailer is, right now making the rounds, and people are extremely excited about Rogue One. I'm excited about it, but at the same time, I look at the trailer and say, it looks like a Star Wars-inspired movie. It looks like fun, but just putting the Star Wars name on it is enough to get that, people excited. And Rogue One is actually an interesting example. It's a different direction for Star Wars, which we'll see if it pans out. Star Trek Beyond didn't really get the same kind of exposure. The first trailer that came out was worrisome. I was like, oh my god, this is a terrible direction for the franchise. And the fact that it's 2016, it's the 50-year anniversary of Star Trek, of the original series, and I'm surprised that they haven't been playing that card more than they have. Paramount was notably absent from Comic-Con 2015 to promote this movie, which makes you wonder, where is the marketing for this movie? Now, Obviously, there was a lot of marketing once it got closer to the movie being released, but there simply was not as much because it's like, well, here's another Star Trek movie, as opposed to, it's been 10 years, now we get another Star Wars movie. So, saturation is another potential reason why there's this financial gap between the two. The third theory, is that reception is how the series have been received. The original Star Wars has a 92 Metacritic rating, and when I look at the Metacritic rating, that is looking at critics from the era, looking at those from when the movie was released, how it was received, and a 92 is pretty damn good. And from there, it basically launched a new era of blockbusters. I mean, the summer blockbuster kind of really arose from, I guess you could say, Jaws, but after that, Star Wars changed the game even more because Jaws wasn't exactly like what the epic that you see Star Wars is, but now it's like that's all you get. Star Trek the Motion Picture has a 48 Metacritic rating, which is not so good. That would be a yellow box instead of a green box. So, of all the Star Wars movies, the worst one has a 51 Metacritic rating, which would be Episode 1. I don't think too many people are going to disagree with that. That doesn't include the Clone Wars animated show, or movie. On average, Star Wars has an average Metacritic rating of 68.4, and Star Trek has an average of 62.6 on Metacritic. So if you look at the receptions, overall the two are pretty similar. But where the distinction really lies is in the fandom. So the original Star Wars trilogy is regarded as one of the best trilogies in the history of film, not just like in this genre of storytelling. It's in the history of film. They say episodes 4, 5, and 6 are just the greatest, one of the greatest sagas that we've ever seen. And of course, when it creates characters like Darth Vader and Han Solo and Luke Skywalker, of course there's going to be this massive response to this and this following. Even though the prequels are lamented, that doesn't change. In fact, lamenting the prequels actually kind of makes the original trilogy seem even better, because it's like, okay, the prequels were this bad, but the original trilogy was so much better. And Star Trek didn't really have that. They didn't have this like trilogy of movies that just like did so well at their time and created characters that were, aside from the original crew, they didn't really create anybody who was an icon in a sense. I mean, obviously you have characters like Khan. I mean, you have Kirk and Spock, who are absolutely icons, but to the same degree as Darth Vader and Han Solo that they did in those 3 movies, because they were already established characters by the time the motion picture came out in 1979. They already had, the original series in, the 60s. So these characters were already known. Even Khan was already known. He made an appearance in the original series as well. And aside from a couple of Star Trek movies, none of them were maligned with the same force as the Star Wars prequels, but there's really none, though, that stand out as like this is the movie that like defined a generation. Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 4 might be the closest from the original series, not to mention the reboot in 2009. Those are probably the closest, but even still, none of those carry the same force as the original trilogy of Star Wars. And like I said, the prequels of Star Wars were that bad that people were saying the original trilogy was that much better. They built up the original trilogy, even though I think Return of the Jedi has like a 68 Metacritic rating. So obviously it was not considered that great when it came out. But we hold it up because we look at the prequels and say, holy crap, those movies are terrible. And the nostalgia for Star Trek has been there since the original series ended. So, and with the rebooted universe, that nostalgia is growing even more. It's like, well, I remember when Star Trek was more like, Next Generation or the original series, where it was more about the adventures and finding out, these mysterious parts of the universe. That was more of what Star Trek was. But the nostalgia has been kind of stagnant, probably because there's it's always been good but not great. I mean, the series has always been cheesy. I mean, Star Wars is cheesy too, but I mean, Star Trek has really had some cheesy stuff. Just watch the stuff from the 60s. It's pretty cheesy. So it's possible that the reception is also part of the reason why these movies are not nearly as good because the nostalgia factor for Star Wars is so much stronger than it is for Star Trek, even though, I mean, the diehard fans of Star Trek are absolutely the ones driving these things, but it's not the same as the Star Wars fans who, when they got those, prequels, it was bad. Whereas some of the, Star Trek movies that weren't as good, like the, Star Trek V, as bad as that movie was, it didn't kill the franchise. It just, people were like, okay, hopefully there's a better one next time. Whereas with the Star Wars, it's like, did they kill the franchise with the prequels? It was an actual fear, which just tells you how rabid that fandom is based on the original trilogy. So, right now, when you look at both of these franchises, they're both actually on the same trajectories. When Star Trek rebooted in 2009, they used the original characters in sort of this prequel alternate universe direction. So they rebooted it with, different actors playing the characters, but they didn't make it its own thing entirely. They still connected it to the original series, just in this alternate universe in that way. Star Wars, you could say, is actually doing the same thing in a sense. Episode 7, you could argue, is a reboot/sequel. It is a sequel, but it's also kind of a reboot, just given the fact that bears such a strong resemblance to Episode 4, A New Hope, and they're trying to distance themselves from what happened with the prequels. So it's kind of similar to a movie like Tron Legacy or Jurassic World, where it is a sequel, but it's also sort of a remake or a reboot. It's really what it is. When Star Trek came out in 2009, when the reboot came out, they added a lot more frenetic action, which was seen as a departure from the roots. And they tried to do that to, match up with, the movies that were coming out at the time. The Iron Mans of the world. Obviously, the Star Wars prequels were a lot more action-packed. They really wanted to make it much more exciting, which is why they brought in J.J. Abrams, who's been, who at that point had done Mission Impossible 3, which is arguably one of the best Mission Impossible movies. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for that one, but I said it. So they did change the timbre of Star Trek in especially that original reboot. Star Wars is also kind of moving on from the original characters with the new ones. So even though they still have the involvement of the old characters, they're focusing more on the new characters like Rey and Finn and Poe and Kylo Ren. So they're trying to turn they're trying to move Star Wars into the next generation, not that next generation, but they are trying to move the story forward so that they're not reliant on this old paradigm that they've been doing. And both franchises rely on unknown actors. I mean, the rebooted franchise had a lot of relative unknowns at the time. There wasn't really anybody in that movie that were like, oh, that's like my favorite actor. I mean, a lot of them are people who are on television or who have bit roles in other movies. So there was, and some young, people like, Zoe Saldana was, at that point, Avatar. I don't think Avatar had come out yet, so we hadn't seen her really in that role yet. So she was still kind of fresh around she was still fairly new to everybody, even though she had been around for a while, especially notably in Pirates of the Caribbean. That didn't go so well, but Star Wars has always used unknown actors. From the very beginning, the first Star Wars, all those actors were unknowns at the time. We hold them up now, like Mark Hamill and Harrison Ford, all that. We hold them up now, but back then they were unknowns. Just like today, with Episode 7, they were all unknown too. With the exception maybe of Oscar Isaac, who had actually been, in quite a few extremely good movies at that point, but fairly unknown actors. But they also got a boost when they brought in, the old cast, kind of like, with Star Trek, bringing in specifically Leonard Nimoy while he was still alive, bringing him into that story to kind of boost the new actors by reminding you of the old ones, but saying, okay, we're moving in our own direction now. And it's no surprise that both of these are on the same trajectories because, obviously, J.J. Abrams has had his power nerd touch, and he's put that on both of the franchises. So, even though Star Trek is significantly lagging behind right now, it doesn't change the fact that they both are on kind of the same trajectory. So it's really hard to want to say, like, why is Star Trek so far behind? If I had to pick a theory, I would definitely pick the first one, because the first theory, which for those of you who've already forgotten, The first theory is that there's a fundamental difference between the two, and that is the difference between science fiction and fantasy. And given the popularity of things like comic books and fantasy just in general, the popular opinion seems to reside in that genre. Science fiction can often be a little too technical or focus on things that are a little bit too real, so that even though some of the stuff that they're proposing is not only realistic but within reach, which makes it mind-blowing, the fact that we can, just imagine to achieve those type of things, that might be a little bit too much for some people, which is unfortunate because, obviously there's things that Star Trek has addressed that, even in their own cheesy way, has still just brought up these things that are like, wow, that is some awesome stuff. Not to mention technologies that they predicted that we would one day have. So it's like, what else do we have in Star Trek that we could potentially see in the next 10, 15 years? So, I mean, that's something that's really cool. But when you're telling a story, especially in a movie, a lot of times the fantasy is going to win over. The fantasy is the one that people are going to get drawn to. And Star Wars just has this mystique about it. It's a hero's journey, which Americans, specifically, Americans love the hero's journey. It's easier to detach from, the hero's journey as opposed to something that forces you to ask relevant questions about your own world, which is what Star Trek does. Star Trek is more about this crew and their exploration and the morality of the world and the universe and human beings in that universe. It's a journey into the unknown, and by asking those questions, it forces us to kind of reflect on the world that we inhabit. And Star Trek 4 is actually a great example of what Star Trek does, which is, when they basically come back in time to save the whales. And despite the many plot holes that coincide with that one, it's the idea of that, there are real problems facing the world. And even though we might come up with these grand solutions in science fiction, these are things that we do need to address. Whereas Star Wars, they're not asking you to look at your world and say, what do I need to fix? All Star Wars is doing is saying, here's our story, hope you enjoy it. So, and I'm not going to discount saturation. I'm not going to say that, the amount of movies is not a factor, because I do think that fewer movies also makes the experience a little bit more special. But thanks to Disney taking over Star Wars, not only did they give us this, say that you're getting 7, 8, 9, in a shorter amount of time than what we were getting before, they're also going to be giving us anthology films, which, Rogue One is the first anthology film, not to mention the Han Solo origin story, and there's also been talk of a Boba Fett origin story or a Yoda origin story. So there's a lot of different things that are going to be coming out of here because of Disney and trying to build this franchise up, which for Star Wars fans is extremely exciting, but it might also kill that mystique a bit and make Star Wars and Star Trek actually level out a little bit, because if Star Wars is winning because of just how many Star Trek movies there are and how few Star Wars movies there are, it could very well be, once they start to even out a little bit, you could start to see that shift again to people who are like, well, now I want something a little more practical and not as silly as Star Wars. But to be fair, both franchises have equally intriguing merit and history, but clearly Star Wars has been the outright winner at the box office, and the best I can come up with is that it's just the fundamental difference between those two series, between what they are at their core. That is what defines why people want to go see Star Wars so much more fervently than they do want to see Star Trek, even though it's confounding in a sense, because if they're saying $60 million is good, we'll take it, that's great. I mean, that's pretty much a little bit more than what Ghostbusters made last week, and that movie came in on the heels of some extreme criticism. So it just makes it confounding that these two series, which are so close in their merit and have such a rich history, that one is dominating the other so expertly at the box office. But again, we could see that change, but for right now, it's very clear that Star Wars is the choice that people are throwing their money at. But again, that might change. But to be fair, if they make another Star Trek movie kind of like Star Trek Beyond, then they really might see that disparity go out of whack, because not going to say it's a bad movie, but it probably turned a lot of people off of the idea. So they really should leave the episodic nature that they had, or the formula, in Beyond. They need to leave that in the television series. Alright, so that's my discussion of Star Wars versus Star Trek at the box office. Hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know what your thoughts are. If you have anything, you won't think differently than what I did. If you agree with me, disagree with me, I don't really care. It's up to you. But the only way I'll know is if you put it in the comment section. So thanks a lot for watching Key Gripe. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.